Colin Rubenstein, thanks very much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Now, is there any real hope of a ceasefire from Israel's point of view, do you think?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the one precondition is that Hamas stops firing these rockets and that we have a situation where a long-term, durable ceasefire can be accomplished. And I would hope that, and I would think that at this point, the Egyptians are mediating with their Hamas allies and pointing out to them that Israel has every intention of stopping these rockets coming one way or the other, and in their own interests they should settle for a ceasefire, because this is certainly would be in the interests of preventing further casualties and destruction on their side. And it's certainly very much, I would have thought, in the interests of the Egyptians, persuade them, because the very reality of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty is on the line here. The Egyptians, while expressing rhetorical and symbolic support for Hamas, nonetheless realise that building up this arsenal, not only in Gaza but also in Sinai, is a very volatile proposition from their point of view, and they have to exercise a degree of responsibility in terms of their own interests in maintaining Western support.
All right, you say just about the ceasefire, you say yes, that's a possibility if Hamas stops launching their rockets. What about Israel stopping bombing?
They're not going to stop bombing while Hamas escalates the situation, as they have been doing in the last couple of days. In response to the initial Israeli forays, precise targeted bombing, what did they do? They sent their more sophisticated missiles into the environs of Tel Aviv and then Jerusalem. In other words, they upped the ante for their own reasons. So this was not a sign that they're ready for some type of compromise or ceasefire.
All right, the blame game, I guess, between Israel and the Palestinian goes on endlessly. It doesn't seem to achieve a great deal. But do you think Israel will launch a ground invasion, as they seem to be preparing for publicly late last week? Or is the fact that that has not happened yet a strong sign that it might not happen at all?
Well, look, I think the blame game is the wrong sort of analogy here. The fact is that Hamas initiated this violence by their attempt to change the rules.
I know, but I've just asked you if you think the fact that the ground invasion has not happened yet is perhaps a strong sign that it might not happen at all.
Well, it may not happen, but we have to differentiate between Hamas's initiation and war crimes, not only on Israel in terms of its indiscriminate bombing of virtually 2/3 of Israel and 3/4 of Israeli citizens, but also the war crime on their own people in using them as human shields in this endeavour. But it's true that Israel is prepared for this ground invasion, but clearly would prefer not to do it, because this raises the stakes, it raises the possibility of more casualties on both sides, and they would prefer to achieve their basic objective, which is to stop this indiscriminate rocket attack, and not just in the short term, but on a durable basis, a long-term basis. And that is their objective, not to dismantle Hamas, which perhaps has been an objective in previous campaigns, but to get security and stability restored on that border, which Hamas and its extremist allies in Islamic Jihad and the various other Salafist groups have been trying to redraw and unsettle. It's important, Helen, I think, to note that we're not only focusing on restoring a stability here in Gaza, dismantling their weapons supply and calling on the Egyptians to ensure that they can't reconstruct their stockpile, but we're also talking about Sinai, which is basically lawless, where you see attacks not just on Israel, but also on Egyptian authorities. And the Egyptians are trying to crack down there, but so far not terribly successfully. Yeah. And part of any ceasefire arrangement must be to address that volatility and that uncertainty in Sinai as well.
All right, but Dr Rubenstein, you say that it's war crimes for the Palestinians to launch rockets indiscriminately on Israel. Do you consider Israel's bombing of civilian communities in Gaza also war crimes?
Absolutely not. Under international
law,
the right of The difference is the difference between the arsonist and the fireman, the law of self-defense. When there is necessity, as there clearly is, with Israel being smothered with indiscriminate rocket attacks, when Israel in its response is meticulously doing its very best to differentiate between combatants and non-combatants, civilians. They're making phone calls, they're sending in leaflets, they're clearly trying to target terrorist leaders and weapons stockpiles. And the fact that Hamas obviously hides behind civilian shields, making that exercise very difficult. But nonetheless, overall, when you look at the number of bombing runs by Israel and the civilian casualties that have occurred, the numbers, regrettable as they are relatively low. And you must recognise,
but they're still lopsided,
that at least 60 of the Palestinian rocket attacks on Israel have actually fallen on Palestinian territory and have been responsible for some of these Palestinian casualties. Not to speak perhaps of some of this misleading misinformation coming from some of the Palestinian authorities,
all right,
which is not entirely unexpected.
Yeah, can I ask you this? Obviously no Israeli government can allow or, put up with rocket attacks on its citizens and its major cities, as you've just made clear as well. But equally, much of the world community looking on would say, well, no one in Gaza should have to put up with or should allow bombings of its civilian areas by Israel.
Well, I don't think that has been the international reaction, Helen. What's sort of reassuring is that certainly the United States, bipartisan support in Australia for Israel, throughout Europe and Canada and so on, there actually is a high degree of understanding that Israel has absolute right for self-defense, that it's doing its best to stop the source of this attack, which is the Hamas leadership and the rocket firing from Hamas, which is a terrorist organisation and so regarded not only in Australia, in the US and Europe and elsewhere, and that Hamas is really hell-bent on continuing its war against Israel. After all, remember, Israel withdrew lock, stock and barrel from the whole of Gaza in 2005 in the hope that the Palestinians and then the Hamas leadership... Well, except
there is a blockade around Gaza, so yes, you might not be in Gaza, but there's an economic blockade on it. But look,
No, there's not an economic blockade. There is a military blockade, and the justification and reason for that blockade is amply demonstrated by what's happening now, is to prevent those missiles and rockets that are coming in, which will be ultimately fired on Israel, which is exactly what's happening. And of course, this is exactly what's needed as part of a viable ceasefire to prevent the resupply of Hamas and its allies, its extremist allies, with these rockets coming from Iran, coming from Libya and elsewhere in the new Middle East.
We've only got a couple of minutes and I just want to move on. Does the Israeli government trust Egypt with trying to negotiate a ceasefire?
Well, I think they understand that it's in Israel's interest at the end of the day to maintain the Israel-Egyptian peace treaty, even though it's being tested in these new circumstances under the new Islamist leadership in Egypt. And I think Hamas has triggered this violence because, one, they're testing the new Obama presidency.
Yes, I'm sorry, you've made that point. Can you just answer me, do you think Israel would trust Egypt to broker this deal? Because wouldn't Israel be, fairly suspicious of allowing President Morsi to negotiate when, his party is linked to the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood, which Hamas also has links to?
Of course, but one has to think that the Egyptians are not ready for a conflict with Israel. At this stage, whatever the future might bring, they don't want it. They haven't established their new government properly. They haven't even established their constitution. The economy is in a very fraught situation. They desperately need Western support. So I think an objective assessment would suggest that Egypt really does not want an escalation. And despite the rhetorical support they're giving to Hamas, they've done very little other than withdraw their ambassador from Israel. And I think from an Israeli point of view, I think there is a degree of cool assessment here that the Egyptians really do want a de-escalation here, and that it would be in their interest to prevent the escalation of conflict, to prevent Sinai becoming more uncontrollable in terms of their own interests, and the need to address the very basic concerns of their own polity and economy. After all, they're dependent on imported food.
All right, so a
they don't want a
ceasefire,
situation
you think,
where they
is
have
the best
poverty.
option to stop the violence?
Absolutely, but a comprehensive and durable ceasefire. And until the Hamas leadership can be persuaded that that's the case, I think they may have miscalculated on the degree of limitless support that their fellow Egyptian Islamist leaders would give them in this situation, and they've underestimated Israel's resolve to put an end to these totally indefensible and unacceptable rocket attacks.
Colin Rubenstein, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.